Pastor Ed here with week 2 of our weekly devotions on the will of God, the subject, the will of God. Last week we talked about God's intentional will. Uh, Today we're going to talk about God's circumstantial will. Again, this is all based on a little classic book written by Leslie Weatherhead, who was a pastor in England during the Second World War, called The Will of God. Again, the subject for today is God's circumstantial will. And I'd like to get into that by talking about something that happened to us a few years ago. Our daughter Kristen spent the spring of her junior year studying abroad in London, England, for a semester, although she had also scheduled class trips to Prague and Stockholm and Rome as well as part of that experience. On her ride home from seeing her off at the airport that January, my wife Jeanette and I started talking about how we should probably get our own passports. Neither one of us had ever had one, just in case there'd be a need, like an emergency, for one of us to go over there while she was still there. Well, lo and behold, just such a need did arise. After working hard in preparation for her midterms and also a major presentation in the Czech Republic, where Kristen was her team's project manager, and not eating right, not drinking enough fluids, getting enough sleep, becoming a little overwhelmed by all the stress and pressure, she got sick on the flight home from Prague. And to make matters worse, their spring break began immediately upon their return to London. And so this meant that most of her fellow students, as well as their professors, were taking time off for sightseeing and travel, leaving Kristen and her roommate Shelby behind pretty much all by themselves. Now, Kristen and Shelby had also made plans of their own to visit Paris and then the French Riviera. But when Kristen got sick, of course, she didn't feel up to traveling. And thankfully, Shelby chose to stay with her out of concern rather than try and go alone, even though this meant that they both lost all the money they had invested in tickets and overnight accommodations. Well, we first became aware of Kristen's situation, I guess, on a Wednesday. And as parents, we were, of course, naturally concerned, especially when we learned that one of her friends had looked into getting Kristen some medical attention. And after having the phone routed to a nurse at a local hospital, she was told that unless Kristen passed out or was otherwise incapacitated, there was really nothing they could or apparently would do for her. Now, I'd certainly heard criticisms about the medical system in England. Didn't realize until just then, apparently, that you virtually had to be unconscious before they helped you. Well, later that same day, Jeanette finally got a chance to look at Kristen via webcam, and she didn't like what she saw. Moreover, it was becoming clear that being sick and alone far away from home was beginning to play on Kristen's mind a little. And when Kristen woke us up with a telephone call at 5 a.m. on Thursday morning, Jeanette immediately asked her point blank, "Do I need to come over there?" Now, it wasn't the first time Jeanette had asked, but this time Kristen finally answered, yes. Well, to make a long story short, we then immediately called one of the members of our congregation, took him up on a previous offer he had made to use one of his friends and family discount certificates from Delta Airlines, where he was employed, to fly standby. And so barely 12 hours after receiving Kristen's phone call, Jeanette was waiting in line to go through security at the airport down in Atlanta, Georgia. Mere 24 hours later, she was arriving safely in London. Interestingly enough, it turned out that she shared the flight with former heavyweight boxing champion Evander Holyfield. More about that in a moment. The point here is simply this: as parents, there are sometimes circumstances when we are willing to literally drop everything in order to come to the aid of our children. When we realized that Kristen wasn't getting better on her own and that she was also having difficulty getting medical attention, maybe was even a little frightened and overwhelmed by this whole experience, our parental instincts kicked in. Even if we had to pay the full price for the airline ticket at the last minute. Fortunately, we didn't because of the family and friends buddy pass. But even if we had to, nothing was going to stop one of us from going over there when our daughter needed us. In fact, it quickly became apparent, to me at least, that Jeanette's maternal instinct had kicked in big time and we're actually in overdrive. I saw the determined look on her face, could tell that not only was she genuinely concerned, but she was also not happy that her daughter was having such problems accessing medical care. Now, I had been married to Jeanette for 27 years at that point, and if I learned anything during that time, it was that you do not want to do anything to harm or mistreat one of her children, because I kid you not, you will live to regret it. And I mean that in all honesty, as the Walter Brennan character used to say on that old TV Western, no brag, just fact. You've probably all seen, I'm sure, those National Geographic specials that show how protective a mama bear in the wild can get when one of her cubs is threatened. Well, trust me, that bear has nothing over Jeanette when it comes to protecting her young. Actually, I remember thinking after dropping her off at the airport that someone in the healthcare system over there had better respond when Jeanette arrived, or they're going to have a big problem on their hands. In fact, if they weren't careful, chances were pretty good that someone coming over on that Delta flight was going to give them a good whooping. And I'm not referring here to the real deal, Holyfield. In addition, it turned out that the very same week, the former Prince Harry, who was serving the Royal Army over in Afghanistan at the time, was scheduled to come home. And so it also occurred to me that if Jeanette was turned loose over there, the British Army might live to regret not bringing home more troops from Afghanistan than just Prince Harry. Now, the good news is that Jeanette quickly got Kristen the medical care she needed, saw to it that she got the rest and nourishment she needed as well. Turned out that in addition to just really being run down, she actually was sick, needed some medicine, which in Great Britain, of course, she received free. So I guess sort of take back my earlier comments about the healthcare system over there. Again, the point I'm simply trying to make here is that at times circumstances, unplanned, unexpected, unfortunate circumstances beyond our intentions or control, nevertheless require our intervention. In other words, a response or some kind of action on our part. Now, in this instance, for example, did we plan on Kristen getting sick over there in England that semester? Did we want it to happen? No, of course not. Although we certainly anticipated the possibility by seeing to it that we got our passports in the event that if it did happen and she needed us, we could quickly come to her aid, which is exactly what took place. Well, the same thing then is also true for God, says Leslie D. Weatherhead. Again, his classic little book, The Will of God, is, as I said last week, the jumping off point for these weekly devotions, because I believe that he has something important and worthwhile to say about this age-old issue. And to briefly summarize, again, Weatherhead's thesis here, he felt that we used the term the will of God too loosely and indiscriminately. And therefore, what he proposed instead was to break down that phrase into three parts. The intentional will of God, which we looked at last week, and as I mentioned at the beginning today, refers to what God intended for us from the beginning of time. In other words, from creation. That is to say that God is a loving and caring God who wants only the best for us, not unlike a human parent, and who created a world for us that was good. Indeed, as the account of creation in the book of Genesis reminds us, it was very good. And so when bad things happen, Weatherhead concluded, they do not happen because God intentionally willed them or because God somehow wanted them to happen. Some bad things happen simply because they're part of God's creation. Natural disasters, for instance, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, and the like occur not because God directly wills them, but because of the way in which God created this planet and then set in motion the laws of nature. And human beings, because we're mortal, are prone to injury and disease and ultimately death. And so when a natural disaster takes place or someone gets sick, perhaps even dies, did God intentionally directly cause this? Again, no, of course not. In fact, the very opposite may actually be true. Much of human suffering and illness is the direct result of our own misguided will, not God's, and the result of human sinfulness, not God's intentions. For instance, during the 2.5 years that I served the congregation there down in Georgia, there was a terrible drought which threatened the entire Southeast. Now, was God to blame for this, or was it simply the result of nature's fluctuating weather patterns, which were then exacerbated by human short-sightedness, evident in our lack of conservation, our wastefulness, an exploding population, and a failure in some areas, Georgia in particular, to plan for and to build more reservoirs? In other words, it's a mistake, and a very dangerous one at that, to confuse God's will with the gift of free will. God gave us the gift of free will, which means that we're perfectly capable of refusing to act in accordance with God's loving intentions for our lives, not unlike a rebellious child who deliberately chooses to disobey his or her parents. And that's usually when we get ourselves into trouble, isn't it? And so where does that leave us? I guess it leaves us with the realization that in this life and in this world, bad things can and do happen, and they are not the will of God. But then the bigger question is, what, if anything, does God do about it? Now, the very antithesis of a God who controls and causes everything to happen in this world, even the bad things, is, of course, a God who does absolutely nothing at all. I remember reading years ago, for instance, that many of our founding fathers were actually deists, which meant that even though they believed in a God, they didn't necessarily believe that God intervened in human or earthly affairs. Instead, many of these folks believed that God was more like a giant watchmaker who designed the world, set it in motion, then stepped away to simply let it run its course. Which begs the question, what's worse, a God who causes bad things or a God who just lets them happen? Fortunately, however, there's a third possibility, a God who doesn't cause bad things, but if and when they do happen, a God who will actually intervene on our behalf. That is just as it was for us when our daughter got sick over in London, when circumstances dictate a God who is clearly willing to come to the aid of his children. Which reminds me of the old story about the religious fellow who was caught in rising floodwaters. He climbed onto the roof of his house and trusted that God would rescue him. Well, soon a neighbor came by in a canoe and said, "The water will soon be above your house. Hop in and we'll paddle to safety." And the religious man said, "No, thanks. I prayed to God, and I'm sure that he'll come and save me." Short time later, the police came by in a boat, and the water will be soon above your house, said one of the officers. "Hop in and we'll take you to safety." And once again, the religious man replied, "No, thanks. I prayed to God, and I'm sure he'll save me." And finally, a Coast Guard helicopter came and hovered overhead. They even let down a rescue line and shouted to the man, "The water will soon be above your house. Climb the ladder and we'll fly you to safety." But again, the religious man replied, "No, thanks. I prayed to God, and I'm sure he'll save me." Well, all this time, of course, the floodwaters continued to rise until they completely covered the man's roof, and he was swept away by the powerful current and died. And when he arrived in heaven, he immediately demanded an audience with God and ushered into God's throne room. He said, "Lord, why am I here in heaven? I prayed for you to save me. I trusted you to save me from that flood." And God said, "Yes, you did, my son. And I sent you a canoe, a boat, and a helicopter, and you refused them all." Whether we actually take advantage of God's intervention in whatever form it takes is, of course, an entirely different question, but this story nevertheless reminds us of what Weatherhead would refer to as the circumstantial will of God, or what he calls God's plan within certain circumstances. Or another way of putting it is how God responds to events in our lives and in the world. One of the classic examples in Scripture, one of my all-time favorite Bible passages as well, has to do with that final showdown between Joseph and his brothers at the very end of the book of Genesis. A story that's been running now for some 14 chapters has finally come to its climax. And if you remember, Joseph had the good fortune, or perhaps misfortune, of being his father's favorite son. And in response, his older brothers grew increasingly jealous and resentful of him and eventually did the unthinkable. They sold him into slavery, took his coat, covered it in goat's blood, and then showed it to their father, who naturally assumed that Joseph had been devoured by a wild beast. Well, clearly his brothers were guilty of an evil and sinful act, and they were solely to blame, not God. But here's the thing, God had a response to that evil. That is, it did not go unanswered. Joseph, of course, if you remember the story, ended up a slave in Egypt, but because of his God-given ability to interpret dreams, he rose all the way up to a position of some power and prominence in the Pharaoh's government. And later in that position, because he was able to successfully interpret one of Pharaoh's own dreams, Joseph was able to store grain during years of plenty and so prepare for the famine, which then followed immediately afterwards. And because of these preparations, many lives were saved, including those of his own family. In other words, Joseph's brothers did a bad thing, but in response, God was able to turn the situation completely around and bring some good out of it. And as we heard, that's precisely what Joseph told his brothers, who were fearful that he would at long last try to exact some measure of revenge. However, the NRSV translation obscures this a little bit. The wording you see is ambiguous enough that it's kind of hard to tell exactly who intended what. A better rendering, perhaps, is found in the Good News translation, which reads, "You plotted evil against me, but God turned it into good." Or the New Living Translation, which has, "As far as I'm concerned, God turned into good what you meant for evil." And the Message puts it this way: don't you see, you planned evil against me, but God used those same plans for my good, as you see all around you right now, life for many people. In other words, Joseph's brothers did an evil thing which created the circumstances out of which God nevertheless brought something good. And therefore, according to Weatherhead, it's important that we make a distinction between the intentional will of God and the circumstantial will of God. God's intentional will, again, reflects what God wants for us. But because of our own free will, we can certainly choose to reject God's intentions for us, and often do. And then it's these circumstances which subsequently require and trigger God's response. Again, human beings can and often do intend evil, but God then takes that evil and brings something good out of it. Furthermore, when we look at the cross of Christ, says Weatherhead, we can see, I think, the necessity of such a distinction. Was it God's intention from the beginning, he asked, that Jesus should go to the cross? No, I think the answer to that question, he writes, must be no. But it was not the intentional will of God, surely, that Jesus should be crucified, but that he should be followed. The discipleship of men and women, not the death of Christ, was the intentional will of God, or if you like, God's ideal purpose. If the nation had understood and received his message, repented of its sins, realized his kingdom, the history of the world might have been very different. Those who say the crucifixion was the will of God should remember, he points out, that instead it was the will of evil men. Now, here we have the very heart and logical center of Weatherhead's argument, and the piece which is perhaps the most controversial, I guess, as well. Because many of us simply assume that the cross was God's intended will for Jesus from the very beginning, and are also then offended when anyone suggests otherwise. I even had to stop and think long and hard about this myself. But the more I thought and reflected and prayed about it, the more I realized that if all God had wanted was Jesus' death, then he wouldn't have bothered with the 2 or 3 years of preaching and healing which preceded it. If it was just about a sacrificial death, then why even bother preaching about repentance and changed lives? No, I finally concluded, when you read the Gospels, it's clear that Jesus isn't just going through the motions. He genuinely hoped that people would truly hear what he was saying, would respond in a positive way. And sometimes they did. And this then was undoubtedly God's original intention or ideal purpose. But that's not what happened, is it? Jesus himself revealed what he was going up against, and also what his likely fate would be when he told the parable of the wicked vine dressers. In that parable, you may recall, Jesus spoke of a man who planted a vineyard and then leased it to his tenants before leaving for another country. And when it came time to collect his share of the produce, he sent a slave, but they seized and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And they did so to the rest of the slaves he sent as well. Some they beat, others they even killed. Finally, he sent his beloved son, saying, surely they'll respect my son. But instead, they also seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Well, not only was Jesus foreshadowing his own death here, but wasn't he also pointing out that this death was clearly not God's intention or will, but rather the evil doings of a rebellious people? And the Gospels even tell us that when the chief priests and scribes and elders to whom Jesus told this parable heard it, they immediately realized that he had told this parable against them. And so in the end, Jesus really had no other choice, did he? As Weatherhead writes, when Jesus was faced by circumstances brought about by evil and was thrust into the dilemma of running away or of being crucified, then in those circumstances, and only in those circumstances, the cross was his Father's will. It was in this sense that Jesus said, not what I will, but what thou wilt. When we heard years ago that our daughter Kristen over in London was ill and needed us, we of course responded immediately. Nothing was going to stop us from coming to her aid. We were willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. Now, we didn't intend for Kristen to get sick, but when it occurred, we quickly responded to this situation or circumstance. Well, in the same way, while God never intended for the evil or the suffering we experience in our lives, nothing was going to stop God from coming to our aid either. God, too, was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen, even more so, because he was even prepared to have his beloved Son die on a cross for us. Now, the circumstances may have indeed occurred outside of God's intended will or ideal purpose, but they did not go unanswered. in the end, God's will, God's circumstantial will was done, just as Jesus prayed for in the garden. Well, that's our devotion for the week. We're going to continue to look at the will of God for 2 more weeks. Next week in particular, we're going to talk about God's ultimate will. So we've got his intentional, original will, and then God's circumstantial will. And then next week we'll talk about God's ultimate will. Well, I hope you have a great week. Hope to see you as always on Sunday, and I'll be back with you next week with another devotion. Until then, take care. Bye.